And to details, President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi praised the Egyptian community in the United States. The president thanked the Egyptian community in the U.S. for the warm welcome during his stay in Washington. President el-Sisi also stressed that Egypt's leadership and government always work to support Egyptians inside and outside the country and will spare no effort to serve the great people. President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi held a meeting on Friday with head of the World Bank David Malpass in Washington. During the meeting, the president stressed the importance of continued coordination with the World Bank as part of Egypt's keen interest to enhance bilateral cooperation and fruitful partnership amid the successive global crises and the repercussions on all economies, particularly the emerging economies. President el-Sisi also stressed the importance of the continued coordination with the World Bank to support Egypt's national efforts to maintain the comprehensive development path with all its economic and social fronts. The president also met with U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. Earlier, President el-Sisi met U.S. President Joe Biden, where they warmly shook hands and engaged in a brief, friendly talk. President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi participated in a session entitled Promoting Food Security and Food Systems Resilience in the framework of the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit in Washington. Addressing this session, the president noted that the international statistics put leaders in front on their responsibilities, given the increasing number of people who suffer from a lack of food security in the world. President el-Sisi also reviewed Egypt's vision for enhancing food security in Africa based on a number of axes, the most prominent of which is the impact of international crises, particularly external debts, as well as introducing mechanisms needed to alleviate the burden of these debts. The president also asserted the significance of intensifying agriculture investments in Africa in order to develop its production and storage capacity. President el-Sisi also stressed that there is a close link between the food and water security, pointing out that Egypt considers this as a national one. The president also called for establishing a legal framework to define the course of ties between the countries sharing water resources. President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi praised the strategic ties binding Egypt and the United States and hailed the increasing activities of U.S. companies operating in Egypt. The president made these remarks as he took part in a dinner banquet that was held by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce at his honor, marking 100 years of establishing official ties between the two countries. The dinner banquet included an open dialogue with the representatives of the U.S. business community, who showed interest in expanding their activities in Egypt. Meanwhile, President el-Sisi reiterated Egypt's keen interest in establishing continued contact with the investors in order to tackle the obstacles facing their work in Egypt. The president also pointed out the important role that the private sector could play in this regard. The attendees lauded the progress of Egypt's economic reform efforts, particularly the procedures taken to promote the investment atmosphere in the country. Presidential spokesman Ambassador Bassam Radi said that President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi's participation in the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit reflects Egypt's keen interest in enhancing the joint African action. In exclusive remarks to the Egyptian television on the president's activities in Washington, the spokesman added that the summit affirms the increasing attention that Africa is gaining at the international arena. Radi said that President el-Sisi's visit to Washington comes in the framework of the strong and extended ties binding Egypt and the United States, based on common interests and mutual respect. Under the auspices of President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, the Interior Ministry announced that the 23rd phase of We Are All One initiative will be extended to the end of the year nationwide. The initiative aims at providing various food and non-food commodities to citizens at low prices. The initiative has hundreds of branches, including key super and hypermarkets nationwide, as well as Interior Ministry's outlets Aman. The commodities are sold at a discount of 25 to 60% of its market price. Upon directives of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, Mustaqbal Watan Party continued to hold meetings to tackle the files which will be discussed in their national dialogue. The party's second meeting was on the economy, with the aim of boosting the Egyptian economy. The meeting discussed the investment atmosphere in Egypt and ways to facilitate procedures for investors. The meeting was attended by members of parliament, government, economic officials, and economic experts. The expected U.S. provision